go ahead and open in prayer. Father, we spent the week thinking about the things that we're thankful for, and we have so much to be thankful for, most especially that we get to be in the heavenly family of Jesus Christ. And we thank you for giving us access to your so great salvation, something we could not possibly have aspired to on our own, but you accomplished it for us in the body of your Son. We praise you for that. And we pray as we study your word tonight, you'll give us a good, solid understanding of where your prophetic program is headed, and an ability to understand the deeper themes of it. And we ask it in the name of the one who is at the very center of this program, the God-man, our hero and high priest, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
So let me share my screen, and we are in the middle of chapter 9. And I just wanted to start with where we left off last time. As you recall, the middle of the chapter has these two really cool verses, 9 and 10, that together tell the story of the two advents of Jesus Christ. The first advent is verse 9, where he's coming in, having salvation in his hand, not the kind that Israel was expecting, but nevertheless having salvation in his hand and lowly, riding on a donkey. That describes what happened back in 32 AD. And then the second verse, verse 10, is a jump forward, at least 2,000 years forward, looking at the second advent, when Jesus Christ will come back, not lowly and riding on a donkey, but in glory riding on a white horse. And in that role, he will conquer his enemies at the campaign of Armageddon. He will then conduct a judgment of the survivors of the tribulation. And together with the people who survive that judgment, he will establish his kingdom on the earth with his headquarters in Jerusalem. And he will, from that position, dictate peace to the nations, and will rule with an iron scepter. And he will rule essentially a confederation of the nations under his rulership, and we will be a part of that government. And in that government, there will be no international war. He simply will not allow it. He instead will act as judge among the nations and settle their problems for them. Okay, and so this is the description of the 1,000-year period. Jane, did you have something?
Yeah, actually, I have a question about the ruling and reigning stuff. Do you believe that the Messianic Jewish people will be, believers will be ruling over Israel, and then the Gentiles, believers, will be ruling over the Gentile nations? Or are we gonna, how much grafting or how much separation is there in this?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and I'm not sure that I have the right answer, but my basic thematic answer to that would be that it really boils down to what dispensation you're in. So it seems to me that the dispensation of Israel, the dispensation of Israel, which would be everything from the calling out of Abram to the beginning of the age of the church, and then jumping forward, also including the last 7 years, the tribulation, that believers in that period of time who die and are resurrected at the time of the second advent will be, the Jewish believers in those dispensations will be ruling within Israel, likely in charge of municipalities, and this, we infer this from the parables of Christ, where he talks about, you'll be given, 10 cities, and you'll be given, that kind of thing. It's kind of like a meritocracy, with Christ at the top as King of Kings, David as the regent under the, resurrected David as the regent under the King of Kings, who is now the King of Israel. And then under David, a tribal organization of 12 tribes. And then under the 12 tribal leaders, those municipalities being ruled by meritorious believers who earned their, Jewish believers who earned that role. And then outside Israel, in the confederation of the Gentile nations, is where I would expect to find the church, ruling, helping Christ to rule the Gentile nations. As far as Messianic Jews, I mean, technically, in my mind, they're part of the church. So,
Okay,
that is, yeah.
I have a follow-up question. So for the Gentile nations, I know that there are certain requirements of the law that they have to be under, like
Yeah.
coming for certain feasts to Israel or sending a representation of their nation. But I'm wondering if those of us who are not under the law now are going to be under the Mosaic law, which is the Constitution of Israel. Are we, the whole world, going to be under the Mosaic law?
Yeah, I mean, it's a complex subject, and there's probably a lot of research needs to be done in this area. But it seems to me the basic simplified answer would be yes, we would be under it. In fact, we would be administering that law. It is a law. It is based on the law of Moses. It is clearly a modified form of the law of Moses, as given by the lawgiver himself, Jesus Christ. And it has to be modified, as you know, because the law of Moses, the original law of Moses, the Torah, applies only to Israel. It explicitly says that. It is for Israel and for no one else. But the law of Moses revised, that we will see during the kingdom of God, applies not just to Israel, but to the entire world. And so therefore, it must be different. It has to be different because it's not localized, it's global. So yeah, there will be, and it's got to be one law, and to my mind, and it's a law that we are subject to as well. But of course, we're in our resurrection bodies, and compliance with that law will be natural for us. So so I think that pretty much is the case. So I wanted to start here because just to remind you that the first half of Zechariah 9 is partially fulfilled. It's prophecy that is already partially fulfilled in the conquest of Alexander, coming down through the Levant into Palestine, and then ultimately to Egypt, and then further east to Persia. In the bigger sense, it'll be fully fulfilled during the time of the second advent of Christ. Then you get to these two verses describing the first and second advent of Jesus Christ, and you'll notice there's no hint of the age of the church in between here, but we know that between verses 9 and 10, there's an intercalation, a parenthesis of the age of the church. And now the second half of Zechariah is going to return to the question, well, now what about, okay, we get it. That's what's going to happen to the Messiah. But now let's get back to what's going to happen to his people, to Israel. And here the focus is going to come back to near-term prophecy. And we're going to see a very near-term prophecy. Remember, this prophecy is being uttered, probably around 518 BC. And the events that it's going to describe are going to happen starting really in about 167 BC. So it's fairly near term. And we'll start with verses 11 and 12. And it says, as for you also, now turning again back from the Messiah to Israel, as for you also, because of the blood of your covenant, I will set your prisoners free from the waterless pit. Return to the stronghold, you prisoners of hope. Even today I declare that I will restore double to you. So this is a very positive prophecy, and it first of all draws our attention to the blood of your covenant. A likely reference to the Abrahamic covenant, because as you recall, in Genesis 15, when God gives the full rendering of the Abrahamic covenant, he takes an animal and himself splits it in half, and then walks, the Shekinah glory walks between these two halves of the animal, indicating that this is an unconditional covenant. Doesn't matter what Abram does or Abraham does. It doesn't matter what the Jews do. God is going to do this for Abraham and his descendants. And so that's what's in view here. There is an unconditional covenant, and the fact that there is an unconditional covenant is going to be the basis for your national salvation and ultimate redemption, okay, is the idea there. And so based on that logic, this prophecy has a command to it, and that is return to the stronghold. Okay, the stronghold being geographically, Israel within Palestine, and then more to the point, theologically, your stronghold is God Himself. So return to your stronghold. No longer be prisoners of hope. Is the idea there. So he goes on to verse 13, and he says, "For now, this is in this verse you're going to see where this general prophecy now gets very specific and gets contextualized to a very specific period of time, because it says, 'For I have bent Judah my bow, fitted the bow with Ephraim, and raised up your sons, O Zion, against your sons, O Greece, and made you like the sword of a mighty man.'" Now, the reference to the sons of Greece puts this prophecy in the time frame of the Maccabean revolt and the Hasmonean dynasty. And this is important to all of us as Bible students. And really my goal here tonight is to first of all, relate this prophecy, so that we can understand what this prophecy is about and what it points to. And then just kind of give a very street level definition of what is the Maccabean revolt, what is the Hasmonean dynasty, and why is it important to us? This is the link between Old Testament and New Testament. The Old Testament ends, and then before the New Testament begins, the Maccabean revolt occurs, and the Hasmonean dynasty is established and rules for about 100 years. And then Rome comes in, New Testament. Okay, that's the context. So all the stuff that happens militarily, politically, culturally, socially during the Hasmonean dynasty is the context of the New Testament. So it's important for us to understand this period of time. In this verse, he makes mention of Judah. Judah, of course, being the centerpiece of the southern kingdom. When the kingdom split under Rehoboam, you had Judah in the south, ruled by the sons of David, and then in the north you had what became known to history as the kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel. But the northern kingdom of Israel had many nicknames in Scripture, and one of those nicknames was Ephraim. And the reason that it's called Ephraim is because one of the prominent tribes in the north is the tribe of Joseph. Now, if you remember way back toward the end of Genesis, when Jacob is blessing his sons, his 12 sons, he gives Joseph a double portion. He gives him a double blessing. And the way that plays out in history is that Joseph had two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. Okay, and so both of them, these half tribes, both of them together, they compose the tribe of Joseph, but they're considered sort of half tribes that kind of gained the status of tribe, a full tribe themselves. So Ephraim is a kind of a nickname for the northern kingdom of Israel. All right, that's what's in view there. So he talks about Judah and Ephraim and talks about how God is going to raise up their sons and pit them against the sons of Greece. Now, you recall from last week that we went over how Alexander, who was the king of Macedon, came over into Asia Minor, conquered the Persians there, and then went right down through the Levant into Palestine, conquered Palestine, wiped out, captured Sidon, wiped out Tyre, went down, took out the Philistine cities, and then visited Jerusalem, but decided not to sack Jerusalem and instead left it alone, just as prophecy said he would, and then moved on into Egypt, where he set himself up as king. And then later he comes back through Palestine again, and then moves off to the east to deal with the remnant of the Persian Empire. You also remember that he died in 323 BC as a relatively young man. He died in Babylon. And when he died, he left no clear heir. And as a result, his very ambitious generals, Perdiccas, Antipater, Seleucus, Ptolemy, Crassus, all these other generals began to fight for who was going to succeed and become the next Alexander. And after a few battles, they finally figured out, well, none of us are going to be able to do that. And so instead, what we'll do is we'll carve up the empire into little kingdoms. Antipater took over Greece. Seleucus took over what we call Syria today. Ptolemy took over Egypt. And Ptolemy and Seleucus began to fight back and forth. Syria, and Egypt. And of course, when they're fighting, they're going to be marching their armies through Palestine where the Jews are. And so the Jews are just like watching a tennis match, back and forth, Israel, or, Egypt, Syria, Egypt, Syria, Egypt, Syria, back and forth. And they don't really care that much because the people on both sides just tell them, you can continue to do what you do, you weird Jews, with your weird monotheism and all that. Fine, just do that. Just don't cause any trouble and pay taxes, and you'll be fine. And this goes on until the rise of Antiochus IV, which we'll talk about in just a moment here. But that's the period of time that we're talking about. Okay, post Alexander, and now the successors to Alexander are going to be the ones that become the new enemies for Israel. So we go to verses 14 and 15, and now here's a picture of what's going to happen. And now when you read this stuff, you kind of might lose your focus after a while because it's just another biblical prophecy about how great Israel is going to be. But keep in mind that the people that are hearing this are in the weakest condition they've ever been in. They're surrounded. They have no army. They have no king. They have no military. They have no weapons. They have nothing. They're completely at the mercy of the people around them, and it's scary. They're very much intimidated. But here's what the Lord's prophecy is concerning these people. Then the Lord will be seen over them. His arrow will go forth like lightning. The Lord God will blow the trumpet and go with whirlwinds from the south. The Lord of hosts will defend them. They, that is the Jews, shall devour and subdue with sling stones. They shall drink and roar as if with wine. They shall be filled with blood like basins, like the corners of the altar. A very exciting, very violent picture of the Jews rising up with the Lord at their head and hammering the enemy, And it's interesting, I think it's very interesting, that he calls out specifically sling stones for a couple reasons. First of all, it's interesting to me because that is precisely the weapon they used in the Maccabean revolt when it began. That's all they had. The sling is a shepherd's weapon, and it's a very primitive kind of weapon. And at the first battle of the first serious battle of the Maccabean revolt, at the Battle of Nahal al-Haramaya, that is precisely what Judah the Maccabee used against the most modern army of the day. Okay, the army of Apollonius, and he wiped them out with sling stones. Okay, so it's a very clear prophecy, and it was fulfilled exactly as rendered. But the other thing about it is, of course, that this nobody people of rump Israel is going to rise up and be able to fight against a modern army filled with experienced generals and every form of combined arms. They have war elephants, they have javelins, they have bows, they have shields and spears. They organize into these very intimidating phalanxes. I mean, it's a fully modern army, and the Jews have slings. Okay, that's how they're going to win. Okay, so it's quite a prophecy, really, when you think about it. So it goes on then, and these are the last two verses of the chapter, and then we're going to go a little bit into the history of it. And it says this: the Lord their God will save them in that day as the flock of his people, for they shall be like the jewels of a crown, lifted like a banner over his land. For how great is its goodness, and how great its beauty. Grain shall make the young men thrive, and new wine the young women. So again, this is a very positive, uplifting picture of victory. This is what victory looks like. God is going to save them, and they're going to gleam like the jewels of a crown, a glorious crown over the land of Israel. And the young men and the young women will be beautiful in appearance. They will thrive because they have a lot of food, they have a lot of wine, they have a lot of oil, they have a lot of everything they need to prosper. And so this is what God is going to do for them. And again, contrast that to the ragged exiles that came back from Babylon and tried to settle, in this land. So it's a really uplifting, picture here. So this brings us to the end of chapter 9. Now what I'd like to do is just very quickly, synopsize the essential history that you should know, or at least that you should be somewhat familiar with. You can kind of place it in your mind like a bookmark, between the testaments. Yeah, Jane.
I was looking at the Hasmonean dynasty.
Yeah.
And one thing I noticed that was interesting is that the rulers were also priests. It's like they were priest kings or priest rulers for like almost all of them.
Yeah, they began, as you'll see, they began as priests, and they contended for the office of high priest. But during the rule of Simon, who was one of the 5 sons of Mattathias, during the time that he was the ruler, he began to take on the title of ethnarch in Greek, which meant sort of not only high priest, I am high priest, but I'm also ethnarch, which is a Greek term that would be meaningful to the Greek culture around Israel. Because if you just said to these other nations, well, I'm the high priest of Israel, they're like, well, who cares? Okay, so what? What does that mean? Well, I'm also the ethnarch. Oh, well, okay, now we know what that means. Okay, so you're the ruler. Okay, so they would understand it. And this is important because the sons of Mattathias are going to be dealing with diplomatic relations with the Greek world around them. So they have to be able to speak in the terms that the Greek world will know. So they start as high priest, then they go to ethnarch, they add that title, and finally they add the title basileus in Greek, which means king. They began to call themselves kings. And this is a very controversial thing to do, because now think about this. As you'll see, the Maccabean revolt starts as a pushback against modernism and against Greek culture, Hellenization of Palestine. And instead of bowing to Hellenism, what the Maccabees are doing is they're clinging back to the law. Okay, but the problem here for them is that the law makes it very clear that the king and the priesthood, the kingship and the priesthood, are 2 separate offices. You can't have the same, one, in one person. That's for the Messiah to do, not for us regular Jews. Nevertheless, they begin to call themselves kings, and some Jewish scholars long after this, looked back on that decision and said, that is why the Hasmonean dynasty fell, because they took on the name of king to themselves, and they should not have done that, because they weren't kings, they were priests. They were not sons of David, and by definition, they're not sons of David. So they have no business calling themselves basileia. That is not appropriate, okay? And so that is an issue, but indeed, they do call themselves kings, okay? Okay, so the Maccabean revolt. So there's a lot of words here, but I'll try to explain the story to you. I told you already about the successors and their warring back and forth across Palestine, the Seleucids in the north, Seleucids being where Syria is, and the Ptolemies in Egypt. And, this goes on for a long time until you get to the year 175 BC. And this is when Antiochus IV succeeds to the Seleucid throne. His father, Antiochus III, was a very capable military man, very capable. And he basically trounced Ptolemaic Egypt and did really well in doing so. And as he did that, of course, he conquered or occupied Palestine. But he said to the Jews, "You go on, do what you want to do. I'm just going to march through here. You'll give me logistical support, and I'll let you alone. That's fine. Do whatever you want to do. Circumcise your children, even though all across the Greek world, we view circumcision as a barbaric, weird thing to do. We don't do it. If you want to do it, fine, do it. We don't care. Just don't cause trouble, okay? But when Antiochus IV takes over, it's the beginning of a series of events that's going to change world history. Antiochus IV, like his father, goes down into Egypt and wallops them. He conquers them, pretty well, to the point that he's about from 170 to 168 BC, he just about conquers them to the point of wiping them out completely and annexing Egypt into the Seleucid Empire. Now, the problem with that is that there's another power in the world that is just beginning to rise, the new superpower that's coming. And they don't like the idea of the Seleucids expanding their rule like that. That power, of course, is Rome. And so Rome sends an envoy to Antiochus IV while he's in Egypt. They send this guy Papillonius, and this envoy approaches Antiochus IV and says, "Hey, we're not in favor of what you're about to do. We want you to retreat, go back to the Seleucid Empire, and don't conquer Egypt." Well, Antiochus IV is very angry about this. He doesn't like it at all, and so he tells this envoy, "Okay, I need some time to think about that." And so listen to this. This is what the Roman envoy does. He takes a stick and he draws a circle in the dust around Antiochus IV. And he says, "Okay, you take all the time you want, but before you step out of that circle, you give me your answer and I will lay it before the Roman Senate." So Antiochus IV, his hand being forced, reluctantly says, "Okay, I will withdraw." So he withdraws. Now he's not in a very good mood at all. Okay, not in a good mood. Okay, well, while he was in Egypt and all that was happening, back in Jerusalem, there are two men who are contending for the high priesthood. One of them is named Jason, and the other one is Menelaus. Menelaus is currently the high priest. He was appointed high priest by Antiochus IV. But when Jason gets word that Antiochus IV is in Egypt, he jumps to the conclusion that Antiochus is dead. And therefore, Jason decides, "I'm going to rise up in a coup and get rid of Menelaus and make myself high priest and, establish my own rule here." Well, when Antiochus hears about that, he views it as a Jewish revolt against his power, and he's already in a bad mood because of Rome. So he comes back into Palestine, captures Jerusalem again, and slays about 10,000 Jews in the city. And he makes it clear that, Menelaus is my guy. And he changes his mind about the policy that his family has pursued up to this point. First of all, he marches into the Temple Mount and erects a statue of Zeus, and therefore desecrates the Temple Mount. He turns it into a place of pagan worship, and he tells them, "From now on, you will eat pig. You will eat pig flesh. You will be forced to eat pig flesh. You will stop this barbaric custom of circumcision. And by the way, that Torah that you guys are so excited about, yeah, that's out. We will burn it. And anyone who's found with a copy of the Torah in their possession will be executed. It is now a capital crime to own a Bible." Okay? And so this is the new Antiochus IV. And then he turns and goes back to Syria. Now, when this occurs, you got to understand that among the Jewish people, there's a bifurcation into two basic philosophies. Some of them are completely comfortable with the Greek world and Hellenization of their religion and everything. They're comfortable with it because it's basically the modern world. Hey, come on, this is the modern world. This is the world we were born into. Everything in the world is Greek. I mean, everywhere you go, everyone knows Greek. Everyone talks Greek. Greek philosophy, Greek art, Greek literature, Greek science, Greek medicine. Everything's Greek. Greek music. I mean, man, you turn the radio on, it's Greek music. I mean, it's everything is Greek. So we love Greece. What's the problem? We can still be Jews and still be Greek. On the other hand, you have the hardliners, the Haredi, the Hasidim, who say, no, we don't want anything to do with Gentiles. We reject everything Greek, and we are going to cling to the law of Moses, both written Torah and oral Torah, and we're going to get back to orthodoxy, And so these are the two groups. Now, those two groups, those two ideas, lead to the birth of two political parties, which you no doubt know about, and which you maybe have not thought of as political parties, but that's exactly what they are. And those two parties are, on the Greek side, the Sadducees, and on the non-Greek side, the Pharisees. These are two big political parties, the Republicans and Democrats of the Hasmonean dynasty. You know, they're very opposed to each other. They have opposite ideas about what is right and what is wrong. And they also have opposite ideas of who they want in power, in political power. And so they're vying back and forth constantly. All right. Now, that's kind of the setup for what's about to happen. And that is that in 167 BC, in a little town called Modin, which is to the northwest of Jerusalem, one day this Seleucid officer comes in by the name of Apollos, and he is there to enforce the policy of Antiochus IV. And so he erects in the middle of the village an altar, and he gathers the little farm village people together, and he says, okay, we're now going to sacrifice a pig to the Greek god Zeus. And so you guys, you're going to have to do this. And so the village priest walks up, and the village priest is an old man. He's old, but he's still very strong. And his name is Mattathias. And Apollos orders Mattathias, take this pig, which I've now bound, and sitting at your feet, take this pig, put it on the altar, and sacrifice it. And Mattathias tells him, you can go to hell. I am not going to do that. I am a priest of Yahweh. This is against our law, and we are not going to do that. We are not going to do that, okay, under any circumstances. And so Apollos begins to finger his sword, he's getting really mad. And right at that moment, another Jewish young man, we don't know his name, walks forward, salutes Apollos, and says, hey, listen, if Mattathias won't do it, I will happily do it. And so Apollos says, okay, go ahead. And so this young Jewish man reaches down for the pig to put it on the altar, and Mattathias snaps. He reaches over and grabs Apollos' sword out of its sheath and kills the Jewish traitor. And then with his backhand, he wallops off Apollos' head on top of it, kills the Seleucid officer. And you can imagine the Jews are standing there stunned. It's like, what have you just done? And then Mattathias kind of, with his eyes, gathers up his 5 sons, tells them to follow him, and a couple of the other farmers take their farming tools, and they sneak into the barracks where Apollos' men are still just beginning to get up, and they slaughter them. They slaughter all of them, kill the entire garrison of Seleucid soldiers. And the great Maccabean revolt of the ancient world has begun. This is a revolt that will change the course of human history. It will reverberate down through the ages. I mean, it is such an important moment. And it is, in fact, the background to the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah, as we will see. And so, as soon as they do this, Mattathias and his sons realize that, well, we're going to be fugitives now. And so they flee into the Gophna Mountains, which are part of the mountains in central Judea there. And this is going to become their insurgent base. Now, within a year, Mattathias dies from the rigors of the campaign, and he has 5 sons that he left behind. But the leadership of the insurgency is going to go to the 3rd son, and his name is Judah, sometimes called Judas or Judah. He is going to become a very famous insurgent leader, and his nickname, because of his fierceness in battle, his nickname is going to be the Hammer, Judas the Hammer. And in Hebrew, that is rendered Maccabee, Judah Maccabee. And so that's why this is called the Maccabean Revolt. And so Judah and his brothers begin to lead this tiny little band of insurgents. And they start operating out of the Gophna Mountains. And, they know they can't take on the Seleucid army yet. So instead, they start going on little raids. And they go into places nearby, and they're very brutal to the Hellenized Jews, the Jews who are compromising with Greek culture. They kill them sometimes, they take their property, they intimidate them, they force them to give up Greek culture. And little by little, the Jews begin to flock to the banners of Judah. They love this message. And so the Seleucids, Antiochus IV gets word of this, and now he is going to send armies southward. And so this is kind of what it looks like. This yellow area here is sort of the area that the Maccabees initially are operating in. Here's Modin up here where the whole thing started. And up here to the north, north of Samaria, north of there is where the Seleucid Empire is. And so these armies this Seleucid army begins to come south. And one of the things, now you understand the Maccabees have no weapons other than farm tools. And they have no military experience. They have no doctrine. They have no industry. They're just a bunch of farmers, but they have the word of God. They have this outrage, of what Antiochus IV has done. And they also have a network of intelligence, because all these little villages here, all around here, have people who are sympathetic to Judah. And so every time they see Seleucid military movements of any kind, they send reports to Judah. So he always knows what the enemy is doing, but the enemy has no idea where he is. And so in this first battle, this huge army led by a general named Apollonius begins to march south, and they're making their way from the lowlands up here up into the highlands of central Judea or Judah. And as they're coming up here toward Jerusalem, they come up to this little place called Nahal al-Haramaya, which is kind of like where this little wadi is. And you got to picture that this Syrian mercenary army is in column formation, and they're marching up into the mountains. Now, they outnumber Judah probably 10-1. I mean, Judah has very few forces. So it might surprise you to learn that Judah's first big tactical decision is he takes the few thousand men that he has and splits them into 4 groups, making them even smaller. He puts one at the head of the valley where the Syrian army is marching. He puts 2 others on the flank, and then puts a rear guard around to the north. And so all of a sudden, Apollonius's army is marching up this defile, and these Jews pop out in front of them and begin to pelt them with sling stones. And they fall back like, what the heck is this? And stuff. And then just as they're trying to recover from that, another group of Jews pops up to the west, and they begin to pelt them with sling stones. And then another group from the east, and finally a group behind them. And now these mercenaries are beginning to panic because they see Jews all around them. They don't know how many there are. They don't realize that they outnumber them like 10-1. And all of a sudden, one of these sling stones whacks Apollonius, the general, and kills him. Well, at that point, the whole thing falls apart, because he's not just the general, he's also the paymaster for these mercenaries. And all of a sudden, the paymaster's dead. What the heck are we fighting for? So they all try to get out. Now get this, Judah and this little Maccabean army of farmers, by the end of the day, they kill every single Seleucid soldier in that army. Everyone. Wipes them out to the last man, and steals their weapons. So now they have weapons, swords, javelins, bows, and other things. And Judah takes the sword of Apollonius and fights with it the rest of his life. He carries it into battle wherever he goes. This is the first great victory. Shocked the world. This is the most modern army on the face of the planet. Just got walloped by a handful of farmers. Okay, and so this is a disaster for the Seleucids. Antiochus is very upset. He gets another army together, and this time this army is going to come down the Mediterranean coast, and then they're going to make their way up through Beth Horon to Jerusalem. Okay, they're going to try a different approach. When they get to Beth Horon, Judas is there waiting for them, because he knew he's tracking their movement the entire way. And he pops out in front of them. They didn't know he was there. And again, routs this second Seleucid army and chases them all the way back to Joppa, killing them all the way back. Okay, twice now he has defeated a huge modern combined arms army with a handful of farmers. Antiochus is really mad now, and so he puts together this humongous army. And it's an army he puts 3 generals in charge of it, Nicanor, Gorgias, I can't remember the third one, but anyway, and this huge ponderous army comes down the Mediterranean coast, and this time they go to a place you may remember from the Bible called Emmaus. And they camp at Emmaus, and they're looking for Judah. They're trying to figure out where he is. And one of the Jewish traders says, "Well, I know where he is. He's up here in the hills, and he's up here in this little town called Mizpah. It's not on the map here, but Mizpah is right about here. And so Judah is right here, and the Seleucids are right here. And so in the middle of the night, thinking that they know where Judah is, where his camp is, Gorgias takes a huge contingent of this army and begins to make his way up into the mountains toward Mizpah. And so Judah, of course, knows about this instantly because he has spies everywhere. And so he builds up the fires, the campfires, and then sneaks away. And while Gorgias is approaching Mizpah, Judah countermarches around him and comes back to Emmaus. And there he camps his army in this little woods that he finds. He camps them there for the rest of the night. Gorgias, meanwhile, comes up to Mizpah, finds the campfires and no Jews, and decides, well, they must have gone higher into the mountains. So he takes off into the mountains. We'll get back to him in a minute. In the meantime, when the sun rises the next day, Judah gets his men up and they creep to the edge of this forest. And there in front of them is a sight that could stop your heart. A fully formed, ready to fight Seleucid phalanx of armed men with sarissa spears and shields, and they're ready to fight, except for one tiny problem. And that problem is that they're facing the wrong way. They're facing south, but Judah is right to the west of them at the edge of this forest. So without even thinking about it, Judah orders his men to charge. And these Jewish guys go crashing into the flank of this Seleucid phalanx, and they absolutely rout it, destroy it completely. Because it's very hard, when you're a Greek soldier and you're holding a 15-foot, sarissa spear, you're not very movable. You're great if you're going forward, but you don't want anything on your side because there's no defense there. And so Judah goes crashing into this phalanx and routs it, okay, and they go running away. So Judah goes over to the camp in Emmaus and burns the camp. And now you have all these prostitutes and slave traders and, merchants, they're all fleeing for their lives. And right about then, Gorgias, who never did find the Jews, comes back out of the mountains, finds that there's, this smoke coming up from where his camp should be. His men begin to panic, and they take off for the coast with Judah chopping them down all the way. So now, 3 times in a row, Judah has bested the Seleucid army. It's an absolute miracle. I'm telling you, as a military historian, I find this campaign fascinating, that he could do this over and over again. So to try to make a long story somewhat shorter, Antiochus now sends a 4th army. This one decides, well, we're not going to repeat these mistakes. So what we're going to do this time is we're going to come all the way down the Mediterranean coast. Then we're going to come in, way south of Jerusalem, and we're going to come up through Beth Zur and into Jerusalem. And when they do, guess who's waiting for them? Judah the Maccabee. He's waiting there with his army, now pretty well armed, and they once again rout the Seleucid army that is trying to come up to Jerusalem, and they flee back to the kingdom. So now he has beat them 4 times. And at this point, he now turns, goes back to Jerusalem, and he basically captures most of Jerusalem, except for the Tower of Acra, which is the one Seleucid stronghold where the Hellenized Jews, have their base of power. But he's able to capture the Temple Mount, and Judah and his men cleanse the Temple Mount and cleanse the temple, and they rededicate the temple. And this is where the holiday of Hanukkah comes, because according to tradition, when they tried to light the menorah, the golden lampstand, they didn't have enough olive oil. And so they had to send out for more olive oil, and it took them time to get it. And they figured that, we're going to run out and the lamps are going to go out. But instead, the lamps burned the entire time until the supplies arrived to the city. And this was considered a miracle, the Festival of Lights. And that's why Hanukkah is known as the Festival of Lights, because the golden lampstand continued to burn, is the idea there. So this is what Hanukkah is about. Now when you hear people say Happy Hanukkah, you know that you're talking about Judah the Maccabee, his cleansing of the temple, and the lighting of the golden lampstand within the holy place. But you also know the military history behind it, which is far more exciting. Okay, and it's far more miraculous in my mind. Okay, so this is the Maccabean revolt of began in 167. So, just so you understand what happens after that. Okay, and I'll try to again synopsize it. The Maccabean revolt originally is down in this little pink area right here around Jerusalem. But ultimately, as the dynasty that is established thereafter continues to rule, the other sons of Mattathias continued to expand their military influence, partly through military conquest and partly through diplomacy. Because ultimately, the Seleucid Empire up here begins to fragment. They have a number of civil wars, and in those civil wars, the Maccabees side with one side and then the other side, and they're sort of manipulating the different sides within the Seleucid Civil War as the Seleucid Empire begins to disintegrate. Okay. Also, the Maccabees find a new friend. They begin to send diplomatic messages back and forth with Rome, which, as far as they know, is so far away it doesn't matter. Okay, but Rome is a power, and so they want to cultivate that relationship, and they do. Okay, so as you can see, by the end of the Hasmonean dynasty, Israel is pretty much almost fully restored, okay, to its historical homeland in one way or another. Now, eventually, they lose little pieces of this here and there, and there's wars at all points of the compass throughout all this. But in general, they get they carve out their old kingdom again. Now, I want to show you this, and this is my last slide, but I want to show you the Hasmonean dynasty. This is what it looks like. These are the rulers. Here's Mattathias, our heroic priest who refused to sacrifice the pig. Here's Judas Maccabee, who is the great, really probably the greatest hero of the Maccabean revolt, one of the greatest insurgent fighters and generals of the ancient world, unsung. Hardly anyone ever knows of him, but he's truly a miraculous leader. Once he is dead, he finally dies in battle at the Battle of Elasa. Jonathan, his brother, takes over. And then when Jonathan dies, Simon takes over. And Simon is really the guy who founds the Hasmonean dynasty, because it is his descendants who go on to rule afterwards, including such famous historical figures as John Hyrcanus I, and then later Hyrcanus II, and his long-standing rivalry with his brother Aristobulus II. These two are going back and forth as to who is going to rule as high priest and eventually as king. And it is the rivalry between these two that brings Rome into the region. Because essentially what happens is Hyrcanus and Aristobulus are fighting back and forth, and they both decide to appeal to Rome. And at that time, Pompey, the famous Roman Pompey, is in the area because he's just whipped up on the Parthians and he's fighting against the Seleucids. And so they both appear before Pompey, and they say, I'm the one that has the right, the right to rule, and my brother is trying to take the right to rule, and it's not fair and whatnot. But in the end, Pompey backs Hyrcanus, and the reason he backs him is because he views Hyrcanus as the weaker of the two and more easily manipulated. And so Rome initially backs him. And then, of course, Pompey eventually dies, and you have Caesar come in, Julius Caesar. And then once Caesar is assassinated, there's a little bit of a break, and the Maccabees are able to reassert their control. But then Augustus comes in with Mark Antony, and ultimately they permanently annex Judea, what they call the new province of Judea, into the Roman Empire. There are still Maccabees that are technically, nominally in charge, but in the end, the Romans take their. There's a man by the name of Antipater, who is an Idumean, who is allied with the Caesars, allied with Rome, and he does a great service for Rome, and so Rome decides to reward him, and the way they reward him is by giving him control of Judea. And when Antipater dies, one of his sons is named Herod. This becomes Herod the Great, and Herod marries the last of the Hasmoneans, Mariamne. and he marries her in order to kind of justify the fact that he is now a bona fide king of the Jews, even though he's an Idumean. And so he marries Mariamne, later kills her, and seeks to kill all of her sons as well, because he doesn't want any rivals to the throne. Herod is quite a figure, if you've read his history. Herod, when Herod comes into the picture, he tries to sell himself as, quote, king of the Jews. Okay. And in order to do that, he does a lot of things for the Jews. He builds up the temple, to make it even more glorious than it is. He does a lot of public works. He tries to portray himself as the ultimate Jew. And one of the ways he does that is he eats kosher. So he doesn't eat pig flesh. And in fact, he very publicly doesn't eat pig flesh. He does, however, have this unfortunate tendency of killing off his own family, because he doesn't want any of his sons to try to displace him. And so during the reign of Herod the Great, there's a famous proverb that says, better to be Herod's pig than to be Herod's son. Okay, because if you're his pig, you're going to be fine. No one's going to hurt you. But if you're his son, you're probably going to get whacked. All right, and so this is basically the synopsized version of the history of the Hasmonean dynasty. And again, remember that the Sadducees and Pharisees are two of the big political parties that are running the show here. Okay, Jane?
Yeah, I was wondering where the name Hasmonean came from, because usually when I hear a dynasty, it's somebody's family name.
Yeah, it is a family name. Mattathias has I think it's a great grandfather or grandfather named Hasmoneah. Okay, a Jewish name, Hasmoneah. And where does that name come from? There are several different theories about that. One is that it comes from the Jewish town of Hashmon, and that it's a form of that, and so maybe that's where the family came from. We're not really sure. There's another theory that relates to, I think it's another one of the sons of Aaron, and a long genealogy that led down to it. But we're not really sure where the family comes from. But Hasmoneah comes from, it's one of the ancestors of Mattathias, and it became the family name, and hence the name Hasmonean dynasty. Okay. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the history between the testaments, and this is why we need to know that. Is that Susan has a question?
Yeah, so my question is, were these legitimate high priests, or because they were not coming off the line of the high priest, they were coming out of the priesthood, but how did they start naming them? Was it just a title they gave themselves?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's really a perfect question, because when we reassemble next week, we're going to blow into chapter 10. And chapter 10 of Zechariah is going to detail for us, from God's point of view, the failure of the Hasmonean dynasty. And one of the ways they fail is by perverting the priesthood and what the priesthood should have been. One of the things that I want you to notice here in answer to Susan's question is, I want you to look at the names here. Okay, let's start up here at the top. And you have names that are conspicuously Jewish names. Mattathias, Eleazar, Jonathan, Judas, Simon. These are very, very Jewish names. And that's very appropriate, because the Maccabees are all about being Jewish and being anti-Greek and being adherents, zealots for the law. Okay, and so your question is very appropriate, because the high priesthood should be inherited from the sons of Aaron. But of course, after the exile, when they come back from exile, we know that at least through the end of the Old Testament, they are able to establish that line. But in the chaos that occurs, in the successor wars and in the time of the Maccabean revolt, the Jews, Mattathias is a priest, so he is in a priestly family. He is a Levitical priest, but he's probably not, a high priest. Simon, when he takes over and makes himself high priest, and Judas, when he acts as high priest, they get that title as a result of military conquest and political power. So technically speaking, they don't actually succeed to the office. They fight their way into the office. And it ultimately, as you begin to follow the line down here, it becomes very corrupt. And that's what I want you to, have that picture in your mind of people bribing, other officials trying to get to the office of high priest, because that's what happened with, after the time of John Hyrcanus the First. His heirs are sending bribes to the Seleucids because they want to convince the Seleucids to back them as high priest. And so that's what's happening here. By the time you get down to Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II, it's simply a political game. That's all it is. And the Pharisees, this is the Pharisees guy, this is the Republican over here, and this is the Democrat. And there's lots of money involved, lots of corruption, lots of dirty deals going down, lots of murder, things like that. And so it's a total mess. Now you also notice that whereas we have very Jewish names up here at the top, how about names like Alexander, Aristobulus? What do those sound like? Do they sound like Jewish names? Antigonus, Mary Ammy. These are names that are Greek names. I mean, they're simply Greek names. And what began to happen throughout the Hasmonean dynasty was that the people, and especially the rulers, the political elite, began to have two names. They would have a Hebrew name, but then they would also adopt a Greek name, because Greek culture was everywhere and it was very popular to do that. And so by the end of the Hasmonean dynasty, this dynasty that is supposed to be standing for the law and for all things Jewish, they've essentially become Greeks by the end of it. Just not very good Greeks, but still they're Greeks, okay? And that's kind of where we end by the time Herod comes in. It's a total mess. And chapter 10 of Zechariah is going to take on this dynasty. What becomes of the Sanhedrin? What becomes of the priesthood? And the people that should be leading the nation in righteousness, instead they're leading it into politics and into corruption and murder and all kinds of terrible things. Okay, so I hope that answers it. I think it'll become more clear to you, next week as we go into this.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, Jane.
Okay.
Go back to Susan then. Yeah, go ahead.
All right. I know in the New Testament there were widows that were Hellenized Jews. So were they, like, you said there were the Pharisees and there were the Sadducees. Were the Sadducees from the Hellenized group?
Oh yeah, the Sadducees are definitely Hellenized. Yeah.
Okay, so any of the families that were among those would have been Hellenized too. So that's where the Hellenized, like when they became Messianic Jews or believers in Yeshua, then they still maintained some Greekness.
I really don't know, because I'm not sure exactly, which ones you're talking about, but it's
in the book. It's when they were trying to decide who was going to feed the widows.
Oh yeah.
And they appointed the 7 deacons, including Stephen and Philip.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a good question, but keep in mind that by the time the New Testament is being written, I mean, the New Testament is written in Greek originally, and so that kind of gives you an idea of how pervasive Greek culture was. There's a lot of Greek, Greek culture, and of course, when Rome defeats Greece militarily, but it's a commonplace in history to say that Rome defeated Greece militarily, but Greece defeated Rome culturally, and so Rome kind of takes on this Greek culture, very much admires it, and continues to expand it. So there's a lot of Greek culture by the time of Christ, and not surprisingly, then the church is also affected by that. One of the earliest centers of church theology becomes Alexandria in Egypt, which is essentially a Greek city founded by Alexander the Great, and very much a place of Greek culture. And so Greek culture worms its way into early Christianity. So yeah, it's kind of pervasive there.
Did the Romans take the gods from Greece and just give them Roman names?
Yeah. And you see that back and forth. There's the Zeus and Jupiter, and those kind of things. So yeah. And Susan, did you have another question there?
Well, a question, comment, like, I guess on your thoughts. It appears to me that the sorry, my grandfather clock is wanting to chime right now. But it appears to me that this kind of led up to the brutality of the Romans, and the fact that in the not so distant past, I mean, just within this 100 and some odd years, they had seen this little band of Jews that could do what they did, and it seems that would you say that it's possible that this led to the brutality of that regime when dealing with the Jews? Were they as violent and destructive all over the world, or do you think that they learned lessons from this situation? Were they more harsh with the Jews than others because of what they achieved during this dynasty period?
Yeah, by the time of the onset of the Middle Ages, the Jews are known as Rome's number one enemy, their most troublesome enemy. Now that reputation might be sort of tainted a little bit because of the Latin Church's anti-Semitism, but the Jews did rise up against them. Now keep in mind we're talking about political parties, right? So in those political parties, there's more than just two. There's the Pharisees and Sadducees, yes. But there's also the Essenes, who basically opt out of everything and go off and become little hermits by themselves. Then there's also the Zealots, of whom Simon becomes a disciple of Christ. The Zealots are terrorists. They're anti-Roman terrorists, exceedingly violent people who want to utterly kill every Roman they can get their hands on. They hate Rome, and they want to be violent about it. Okay, and so the Zealots are there. They're operating. Rome knows about them, and they're always on the lookout for the Zealots. There's also other political parties as well that fall somewhere along the line of resistance or collaborators. The Sadducees are the most obvious collaborators. There's also another political party called the Herodians, who are the party of Herod, and they're also Hellenized Jews, and they're in tight with Herod. Then you have the Pharisees, the Essenes, the Zealots, and others who are part of the resistance. The Jews do rise up again. During the war with Rome that starts in 68. They rise up, and the Zealots have a big part of that, and they rise up very violently and kill as many Romans as they can get. And then about 100 years later, during the Bar Kokhba rebellion of 132 to 136 AD, the Jews rise up again under Simon Bar Kokhba, and they wallop the Romans and toss them out of Palestine completely, and they win autonomy for a while. I mean, to the point that they're making coins and everything. I mean, it's a pretty big victory. It lasts for 4 years, and then then the Romans come back in and utterly destroy the Jews and throw them out, and that's the beginning of the Great Diaspora when Rome comes back in. So yes, they know that the Jews are capable of great violence. They're wonderful guerrilla fighters. They take every opportunity they can to win independence again and to resist the Hellenization and the Romanization of their land. And so Rome responds very violently. But of course, that's Rome's default anyway. Everywhere they go, they respond very violently, but especially with the Jews. So yeah.
And then what happened that I'm not going to be able to think of the reference at the moment. It's obviously in one of the Gospels, but it was Jesus was going up for the winter festival. So it had to be Hanukkah, from what I understand, just kind of reading about it. What had happened in this short amount of time between the Maccabees and Jesus's time that was it only because the miracle was being celebrated of the oil?
Yeah.
Or was that the only reason Jesus would have been there? Because it's not one of the, obviously it's not one of the prescribed things that he was required to celebrate. Was it just in recognition of this? Or
yeah, right. It had become, a holiday, right after the time of Judah Maccabee. So, it was 100 years old by then, or even more than 100 years old of tradition, traditionally celebrating that incident. So yeah, it was
so really just a holiday, something to celebrate.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
Festival of Lights, and they would, as a part of that, they probably, would get together and tell the Romans, well, we're celebrating the Festival of Lights. It's all about lighting the the menorah in the holy place. And what they're not telling the Romans is it's also when we wallop, the Gentiles and won independence for ourselves. So if you're a savvy Roman, that's what it's about. But the rest of the time, it's just the Festival of Lights idea. So yeah. Any other questions, discussion there? Geez, we went way over time. Yeah, so I'm sorry, I try to make that as short as possible. I know it's it's a very lengthy and interesting history. It would make a wonderful series on Netflix, and maybe someday I will write that series. I don't know. That's maybe something to do in retirement. Suzanne's nodding. So yeah. So it's kind of like Game of Thrones kind of stuff, minus the dragons. But anyway, so that's the background. Again, I commend it to your attention. Next week we will assemble. We'll do chapter 10, which is a God's viewpoint on the performance of these little knuckleheads here. Okay, and as you'll see, it sets up the backdrop to the arrival of the Messiah, because the good shepherd is coming to displace the bad shepherds, and the bad shepherds, you're looking at them right here, the Hasmonean dynasty and the aftermath. Okay, so that's what that's about. All right, so we will end it there. And